Hello, my name's Rory McAvoy, and I'm here with Ralph Pokluda, and we're talking about an interesting clock by White Matlack.
Correct.
Ralph, welcome.
Thank you for having us. It is a nice clock. It's an interesting clock. Um, the dial face of the clock is signed White Matlack in the city of New York in what would become the colonies, um, and subsequently the United States. A lot of New York signed clocks are actually English clocks that were exported out of England for that New York market. Uh, New York City was the third largest state in the 19th century, 18th century. That's when this clock was made. And for some reason, they imported more clock mechanisms and complete clocks to New York than they did into Boston, Massachusetts, or Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Both of the latter two states had a lot of clockmakers, but for whatever reason, and I don't know that answer, there were few um, true clockmakers, where they made the whole clock mechanism, maybe had an engraver engrave the dial as this one is. But there were few in the city of New York for some reason. Um,
That's interesting. So, from your experience in this period, and I suspect this was made around about the 1780 mark. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
well, it could be just before what would become the Revolutionary War, or shortly thereafter. The war was 1776, and there were scuffles before that and everything, but the war really lasted for 6 years until the treaty was signed, really 5 in war. So if it was made post-war, it would have had to been in the early 80s. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
And what we call the single sheet silver dial, that's what I call this form of dial, which was different from its predecessor, the what we call composite dial, made up of various elements.
So we're talking with sort of a decorative brass center with spandrels to the corners, and then
exactly
applied
right.
chapter rings. Yeah.
Exactly right. And that was the popular dial, as you know, in the 18th century. But in 1772, we started to see what we call today in America painted or white dial clocks, where you have an iron dial plate enameled and then all the decoration painted on the enamel. This was sort of a period in which this was competing. This form of dial was holding on to that still engraved dial, and you can see all the numerals and the name engraved into the facade.
It's interesting. I associate these flat brass dials with that era where the painted dial is starting to come
Correct.
out of in the UK, predominantly out of the Midlands.
Correct.
And you see a resistance to this northern trade in
Right.
London, and the makers stick to the tradition, but they're sort of meeting people halfway with
That's
the
right.
flats and generally silvered.
Right. It's the real rarity for me to see a painted dial marked London. I have seen some, but I could count on one hand the number of times I've seen it, and the
They
name
do
is
exist.
legitimate.
Yeah.
Sometimes things are improved over the years, and a signature was added or whatever, but there was some usage, very limited, of the painted dial clock. The London makers typically like this look, the engraved dial.
That's very true.
Yeah.
There aren't many. There are, yeah, as you say, very few surviving.
That's correct. This is a beautiful dial, understated.
So here's a question. So if this is signed by White Matlack of New York,
Correct.
what, to your mind, is different about the engraving of this dial compared to one signed by a London maker, for example?
Well, the quality of this engraving is almost looks like London work. I mean, it's top drawer stuff.
Mhm.
there's a real flourish to this dial, and it's the rare American engraved dial, whether it be the composite dial or single sheet dial, that's engraved this nicely. This was superior work, and I really don't know why those great engravers maybe didn't come to the States, because they were engraving silver, hollowware, and clock dials. But typically the clockmaker was not the engraver. You can usually see some dials made here in the States that can be a bit naive, and sometimes just done by the clockmaker who had a level of skill in that area. But that usually was a separate trade.
Yeah, I think if you look at the history of, sort of more prominent names in the history of clockmaking, like Thomas Tompion and George
Yes.
Graham, it's known that they had engravers who engraved plates for printing,
Yes,
actually working from their premises.
sure.
And that, one can conjecture, probably makes sense for them to also be engraving
Sure.
dials and
Sure.
watch
Yeah,
components.
they would do a variety of different, or in a variety of different fields, support that, whether it's scientific instruments, clock dials.
Mm.
That trade was a popular one, a skilled one too. You notice like some of the flourish on the letters on this one. There's really that brass was peeling off their chisel, their tool, their cutter, and they were moving quick. It wasn't like they were making little stabs at it.
So their graver was flowing. Clearly, when you look at the Y
Yeah.
of York, it's got a lovely double curl, hasn't
And
it?
not only were they creating a turn or whatever, but they were changing the depth of the cut as they went to accent that flourish. And that takes a lot of skill, but you've got to keep in mind they did this every day of their lives.
I'm looking at it close up. The engraving is really, as you say, top notch stuff.
It is. And it speaks to, and I believe this mechanism, although it shows a London quality. You mentioned the Midlands, and it's probably where the clock was made, and then exported, I think, to America.
Well, it's interesting. I just want to go back to the engraving for a second, but the numerals are slightly shorter than I would expect
That's
to
right.
see for
Well, there
a
was a
clock of the
period where this was the style or the taste where the 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and so on were almost the same size. That was usually in Arabic numerals.
Mhm.
And those numbers were almost the same size as the Roman numerals that would show the hour track.
That's a feature I cannot recall ever seeing in a London or an English clock.
You see it on, I think they were looking at the painted dials for that.
Mhm.
Because you'll see that period, there was a period in time when that was the style. And that helps us really date this, going back to your comment. I could make an argument that this was right before the Revolution. I almost think that, after the war, which would have been the early 80s, the painted dial had already been produced for 10 years, maybe no exportation, to the States maybe, or limited exportation during the war years. But this was actually falling out of favor by that time. Now, again, your point is well taken. London, they never embraced that. This is the style of dial they would embrace in London, or that Midlands area. They had a wealthy client that could afford the best, and this was the best.
And that is reflected in the quality of the case.
It
It
is.
has the most glorious figure
Oh.
in the mahogany veneers.
And also, I don't know if you've ever picked up that case, but that case is heavy. I thought the family gold was in the bottom. That mahogany is so dense, top drawer, highly figured. Even the moldings and all are nicely figured. They undoubtedly had a client when this clock was made, and the clockmaker, as you know, didn't make the case. That was a different trade again. Cabinet maker. They had a client that said, "I want the best," and the cabinet maker said, "I can give you the best." And the attention that the cabinet maker brought to task was the best.
One thing that I couldn't help notice is The case looks very much in the tradition of the clocks made in this period from the northwest of England, from the Liverpool region.
Yes.
With the swan neck pediments.
Yes.
Underneath the swan neck pediments on this clock is mahogany veneer, but on a Liverpool clock you generally see painted glass.
You do.
But the shaping of the door as well, very, 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 it sort of very much strongly echoes that style, which is interesting.
It does. That period where in the tympanum area, which is sort of the hood section above the dial, as you mentioned, a lot of times did have, when we say, or reverse glass paintings in that area. But the shape of the swan neck at the top, as you mentioned, it's sort of from that region. That again, it may also be a reflection of what that New York White Matlack in this case was requesting. He may have given them some direction, because I don't know of not a precedent, but I don't know an example even of that form of case in the States with that painting in the tympanum area. So it may have just been a regional taste that says, well, we're making this for export in this case, and no, they don't want that. So it all speaks to what the customer wanted and what they could afford. Undoubtedly, this customer was particular about what this clock should look like.
So, Ralph, can you tell me a little bit about the mechanical aspect of this clock, please?
It's an 8-day clock. And as you know, what that means is you wind it once every 8 days, or most people just pick 1 day a week to wind their clock. And that's the best thing to do. Typically, how you tell or make a distinction between a clock that runs 8 days on a wind and the 1-day clocks. The 1-day clocks were lesser expensive. They're about half the price of the 8-day example. But the 8-day example will have the winding holes in the dial. Now, there's some 1-day clocks that have winding holes in the dial. That's rare. But you can be an expert 99% of the time in saying that it has winding holes in the dial to use a crank and crank up the weights, that's going to be an 8-day clock.
And having an 8-day clock in the 1700s was much better than having a 30-hour clock.
Oh, yeah. Matter of fact,
go on.
Well, we see so many clocks, particularly in America. I see it occasionally in England where they would either in the white dial period paint on the winding arbor to simulate the square, because in the low light situation in these cottages where the 1-day clocks were, people could see it looked like there was a winding arbor there, and naturally it was a prestige item to have anyway. And even more so if it was an 8-day clock. People knew that the 8-day clocks were very expensive. A 1-day clock was expensive too.
When you look at the movements on this one, we've got 2 barrels.
You do.
And they have like a turned screw thread on them.
That's right.
To take up the lines very carefully.
Exactly. It's channeling that cable. When we get up into Scotland, a lot of times the clockmaker was appealing to a little more down market client. Maybe wanted an 8-day clock, but he may not have even had the tooling to be able to produce a grooved winding drum where when you're cranking up the weights and the cable is running down the drum, it's not racing too fast and fouling up in the mechanism. This clock naturally has, all the bells and whistles. It has a strike silent feature, which is very atypical. Typically at the time, again, this clock is going to be right after the Revolutionary War. Most people would, if they even owned a clock, would typically have one. Now, there would be no reason to silence it, but in this case, they felt like they had a client that maybe had a shelf clock or another clock in the house, and they didn't want, in this area, I don't want a clock striking, and they had the ability to silence it.
So, we've been looking at some other clocks in the collection today, and we looked at a clock by a maker from New Jersey.
Oh, sure.
And I wonder if you'd like to compare the difference between the clock we have here and that one.